Welcome to Temple Israel of Hollywood. My name is John Rosoff. For those of you I don't know me, I'm the senior rabbi here. And I join with all of my synagogue's clergy and educators and staff and board and officers in warmly welcoming you to our congregation for this special evening of dialogue and debate about some of the most critical and essential challenges facing the state of Israel and the American Jewish community. And I want to thank first and foremost my friend and Peter's friend, Donna Bajarski, a member of our community since she was born into this community, for making this shidduch possible in bringing Peter to Temple Israel. This is, though he'll be speaking at UCLA tomorrow to the student body, this is his only Los Angeles speaking engagement. I'm also very grateful to the Jewish Journal of Los Angeles as a sponsor with Temple Israel of Hollywood of this evening, as well as to 5 sister congregations as co-sponsors, including Temple Emmanuel, and Rabbi Jonathan Aaron is here from that synagogue, Beit Chaim Chadashim, and Rabbi Lisa Edwards, and newly ordained Rabbi Rachel Adler, who is well known to our community for many, many years as a preeminent feminist Jewish scholar, to Temple Isaiah, Ikar, and Congregation Kol Ami. And I don't know if any of their rabbis are here, but I hear the congregants are. For your information, this event is being streamed live on the Jewish Journal website. There are many other rabbis here. One I just want to acknowledge, a dear friend from Jerusalem, Rabbi Uri Regev, who is the director of Chidush, an organization advocating on behalf of church-state separation in the state of Israel. Our speakers tonight are Peter Beinart, the senior political writer at the Daily Beast, the online home of Newsweek magazine. Peter is the editor of the Daily Beast blog, Open Zion, and the former editor of the New Republic magazine. Most recently, you like those publications, that's good. Most recently, Peter authored this book, The Crisis of Zionism, which has sparked international debate with both praise by such luminaries as President Bill Clinton, Edgar Bronfman, Lee Hamilton, former congressman and vice chair of the 9/11 Commission here in the United States, and Naomi Chazan, former deputy speaker of the Knesset and president of the New Israel Fund. I'm also pleased to welcome back David Suissa. And I just want to say to him, happy birthday. Today is David's birthday. David is the president of the Los Angeles Jewish Journal. He writes a weekly column there. He is the founder of Alum Magazine, and he spoke in dialogue with Jeremy Ben-Ami, the president and founder of J Street, here on this very stage last year around this time, in conversation that was not only distinguished by thoughtful dialogue between Jeremy and David, but which served as, I think, a model of civility between 2 passionate Jews who both agreed on some things and disagreed on many others. In response to Jeremy's invitation that night for David to speak at the National Conference of J Street this past March, David accepted. Both he and Peter were highliners at that conference. So on to this evening. The format for the conversation tonight will be as follows. Peter will speak first for 15 or 20 minutes, followed by David for the same amount of time. Then they will have an opportunity to dialogue with, question, and debate each other. Following their exchange, I will pose questions to each speaker, and they can continue their conversation from there. We're not going to open questions from the floor, and you can trust me that in my questions, I'm very nonpartisan. I ask hard questions of both of them from the opposite perspective. Both our speakers are passionate and thoughtful American Zionists. They both love the state of Israel and the people of Israel, and they both care deeply about the future viability and security of the state. They differ on many things, but let no one mistake their hearts. To claim otherwise is nothing short of rechilut, slander. That being said, Our speakers tonight are also American Jews and not Israelis. They are speaking as American Jews, though Israelis are the ones who must make the critical decisions around peace and war and security, as they are the ones who must bear most directly the consequences of their decisions. This is not to say that what Israel does has no effect on us in the diaspora. Consequently, we have, I believe, a moral right to be part of this conversation. Like many of us, I was drawn in and engaged by Peter's book, The Crisis of Zionism. In a thoughtful piece published this past week about it, Professor Shaul Magid of Indiana University wrote that the response and rancor around Peter's book represent four broad groups in the American and Israeli communities: the ideological left and ideological right, and the pragmatic left and the pragmatic right. And a brief word about this might help to give context to our conversation this evening. Those in the ideological left, Dr. Magid said, question the viability of a Jewish state, preferring a liberal democratic state that would result in a one-state solution. Such an eventuality would mean the end of Zionism as we know it and the end of the Jewish state of Israel. The ideological right includes a combination of Zionist revisionists and theological messianists. They understand territorial maximalism as necessary for Jewish survival and tolerate also a one-state solution. Such an eventuality might mean the survival of a Jewish state, but a state ruled by a Jewish minority in time over the Arab majority, thereby sacrificing democracy. The appropriateness for Israel, many of them question altogether. That is democracy in Israel. The pragmatic right and left are much harder to define. The pragmatic left often uses rhetoric from the ideological left, but attenuates it in terms of the welfare of the Jewish people and the importance of democracy, helping to define the character of Jewish nationalism as embodied by the state of Israel. They are concerned that the occupation is compromising Israel's democracy and adherence to human rights. Included among them are J Street, Shalom Achshav, B'Tselem, the New Israel Fund, and Peter Beinart, as he has demonstrated in his book, The Crisis of Zionism. The pragmatic right uses the rhetoric of liberalism that includes an exceptionalist claim regarding Jewish nationalism, but looks to Jewish history rather than theology or hardline ideology to make its case. The pragmatic right argues that security must be the overriding, driving necessity for the Jewish state in any potential two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This group includes AIPAC, the Shalem Center in Jerusalem, the Conference of Presidents of major Jewish organizations, the center-right Israeli government, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, David Suissa, but you'll tell us one way or another. Okay, so our goal this evening is simple: to allow two thoughtful, passionate American Zionists to challenge each other and us with respect and civility, the most critical issues facing the American Jewish community and Israel. We will proceed in the spirit articulated by the Talmudic formulation, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. These and those are the words of the living God. It's my pleasure to invite Peter Beinart forward to speak to us about what he means by the crisis of Zionism and what he believes is our role as American Jews and what dangers he believes Israel and Zionism face. Peter.
Thank you, Rabbi Rosov, for extending me this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with David Suissa. We met quite a few years ago. We've been arguing ever since, and I've enjoyed every minute of it, and I'm privileged to call him a friend. I know this is a controversial subject, the relationship between American Jews and Israel. After my book came out, a friend asked me, have there been any angry words, personal denunciations, ad hominem attacks? And I said, you mean outside of my own family? Yeah, there have been a few. My wife sent out the kind of email that spouses sometimes do. She said, you can agree or disagree with Peter's argument, but we're very proud that he wrote a book. So She got an email back very quickly. She said, I would never buy that book. Peter's a fraud. He's a threat to the Jewish people. I wouldn't give him a dime. So my wife forwarded on the email, and she said, he's really angry. Who was that? And I said, don't you remember? That's my cousin David. Not this David. It's another David. My mother said it's a good thing that my grandmother doesn't know how to blog. Let me start by explaining why I'm in this game, why I'm a Zionist, why I believe that Israel has been such a blessing for the Jewish people. First, it's a blessing because we now have what we did not have in the 1930s and 40s when our people were being led to the slaughter. We have a state whose mission statement is the protection of Jewish life. There may be those who don't believe we need such a thing anymore. I'm not amongst them. I'm old enough to have been profoundly affected when I was in high school by the sight of a Jewish state sending planes to pick up some of the most reviled and destitute people on the face of the earth, the Jews of Ethiopia, and return them to relocate with the people they had been cut off from since the days when the temple stood. So I don't take the idea of Israel as a refuge for the Jewish people lightly. Secondly, Israel is a blessing because thanks to the Zionist movement, we have a Jewish state as a cultural center for Jews around the world, based upon the revival of Hebrew as a living language. And with all the problems that we have maintaining diaspora Jewish life today, one can only imagine how much harder that would be if we didn't have Israel and a revived Hebrew language to anchor us. But these inspiring, indeed miraculous accomplishments are being put at risk by Israeli settlement of the West Bank and the resulting threat to Israel's character as a democratic Jewish state. Democracy is not the whole of the Zionist dream. Israel is not, should not be a secular democracy like the United States. It should have, as I argue in my book, a special obligation to the Jewish people. But if democracy is not the entirety of the Zionist dream, it is necessary to the Zionist dream. Theodor Herzl understood this. His novel Enfant is largely about an election in an imaginary Jewish state between one party that includes Arabs and gives Arabs the right to vote, and another party that would restrict the vote only to Jews. And Herzl in the novel has one of the candidates who believes in democracy say, to the people of this Jewish state, you must hold fast to liberality, tolerance, and love of mankind. Only then is Zion truly Zion. Israel's founders understood the necessity of democracy to the Zionist dream. In 1948, 3 years after the Holocaust, with the stench of Jewish death still hanging over Europe, with Israel in a war for its very survival against its Arab neighbors, fielding an army composed in significant measure of people with numbers tattooed on their arms, Israel's founders wrote a Declaration of Independence that promised complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of race, religion, and sex. For me, that democratic vision is crucial to the miracle that is the Jewish return to sovereignty in the land of Israel, and it's a large part of the reason that an Israeli flag hangs in my 6-year-old son's room. But that miracle is today imperiled by Israel's control of the West Bank, where in flagrant violation of the principles of Israel's Declaration of Independence, Jews carry identity cards with blue covers that give them citizenship, the right to vote, the right to live under civil law, and the right to be waved through checkpoints. Palestinians, by contrast, carry identity cards with green or orange covers that deny them citizenship, the right to vote, place them under military law, and impose massive, often humiliating restrictions on their movement. This is not to say that Jews who live in the West Bank, some of whom I consider my friends, are bad people. They're not bad people. They're mostly people who moved to the West Bank because the Israeli government made it cheaper for them to live there. And it's not to say that Jews should not be able to live in the West Bank, a place of deep historical resonance to us, a place that, according to Jewish tradition, all the patriarchs and matriarchs are buried. Jews should be able to live in the West Bank, either as equal citizens in land annexed to Israel in a peace deal, or as equal citizens in a Palestinian state. The problem is not that Jews live in the West Bank. The problem is that they live in a place where, contrary to the vision of Israel's founders, citizenship is ethnically based, where Jews and Palestinians live under a different law. And as David Ben-Gurion warned, if Israel makes permanent its occupation of the West Bank, it will be forced to choose between its Jewish and democratic characters. It will invite Palestinians into a one-state struggle that Israel cannot win, because its efforts to maintain itself as a non-democratic Jewish state will make it a pariah in the world. This is what Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert meant when they warned about the coming apartheid future and the South African-style struggle for the character of one state. It's what Tzipi Livni meant when she warned recently that, quote, the existence of Israel as a democratic Jewish state is in mortal danger. I want to be very clear. The Palestinians do bear significant blame for the failure to achieve the two-state solution that will allow Israel to remain a democratic Jewish state. The Palestinians have badly undermined their cause through terrorism that I call in my book grotesque and unforgivable. There is a troubling Palestinian tendency to deny the historic connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. And as I say in my book, there are real questions about whether Palestinian leaders will make the compromises on the right of refugee return, necessary for a two-state solution. But even if I conceded every nasty thing anyone could possibly say about the Palestinians, it is not the Palestinians who are essentially paying Israelis to move into the West Bank. It is this Israeli government that has reversed its predecessor and made much of the West Bank a national priority zone eligible for special government subsidies. It is this Israeli government that recently legalized 3 West Bank outposts that had been illegal even under Israeli law. It is the finance minister of this Israeli government who recently boasted that government money was helping to build a cultural center in Kiryat Arba, in Hebron, one of the most militant settlements in the West Bank, and who boasted that government money had helped to build a cultural center in Ariel, a settlement that stretches 13 miles into the West Bank, and which, according to former Israeli Foreign Minister Shlomo Ben-Ami, therefore makes the contiguity of a future Palestinian state, quote unquote, very difficult. And 2 weeks ago, the former director of Shin Bet from this Israeli government, Yuval Diskin, said, quote, forget about the stories they're selling you in the media about how we want to talk, but Mahmoud Abbas won't. I'm telling you, we're not talking with the Palestinians because this government has no interest in talking with the Palestinians. This government has no interest in resolving anything with the Palestinians. I know from up close. Shaul Mofaz, as it happens, said something very similar. Now he's in the government. We'll see whether anything changes. So it's not enough to say that Israel will get a handle on settlement growth when the Palestinians finally decide to live in peace in a two-state solution. Because by supporting settlement growth, you're pushing Palestinians in exactly the direction we don't want them to go. Every time Israel subsidizes more Israelis to move to the West Bank, we make those Palestinian leaders who will reluctantly accept Israel's right to exist and who are cooperating today against terrorism, as Israel's own defense officials have said Mahmoud Abbas and Salam Fayyad are, we make them look like fools. And every time Israel makes it harder to build a viable Palestinian state, we make Hezbollah and Hamas stronger. We don't know whether Palestinians will ultimately make the concessions on the right of return necessary for a two-state solution to come to pass, but we can be darn sure they won't make those concessions if in return for them, they won't even get a viable contiguous Palestinian state. So even if you don't believe that a Palestinian state is possible tomorrow, you have an obligation to try to stop the settlement subsidies that will soon foreclose the possibility of a Palestinian state ever. It seems to me that David has to answer that question tonight. It's my central contention. How are we going to stop the settlement growth that Israel's own leaders, many of them, have warned threatens to destroy Israel as a democratic Jewish state? I want to end by quoting one of Israel's foremost experts on the settlements, former Ariel Sharon advisor Talia Sasson, who said in an interview recently, quote, if you continue to build settlements in the West Bank, you are placing the destiny of Israel as the national homeland of the Jewish people in the hands of the Palestinian people, unquote. Because when you destroy the two-state solution, you give Israel's enemies the capacity to do politically what they have never been able to do, thank God, militarily, destroy Israel as a Jewish state. Zionism at its core is about giving Jews control of our own destiny. Settlement growth threatens the core of the Zionist dream because it takes that destiny out of Jewish hands. If American Jewish organizations do not end their silence on this question, if they do not help Israel regain control of its destiny as a democratic Jewish state, we will be betraying our profound obligation to keep alive the Zionist dream for our children and grandchildren. And that's why, frankly, I'm not so concerned about the difficult conversations I tend to have these days with people like my cousin David. I'm far more worried about the conversations I will have with my 6-year-old son and my 4-year-old daughter one day if on our watch, we allow the dream of a democratic Jewish state to die. I don't want to have those conversations. That's why I wrote this book.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Peter. Thank you to the whole community of Temple Israel of Hollywood. Welcome to everybody around the world who's watching this on jewishjournal.com live. Can you hear me? When I say everybody around the world, I mean my 6 cousins in Montreal. So when I hear my friend Peter talk about his love for Israel, it's really the subject tonight. How do we express our love for Israel? And when I hear him speak about his deep desire to make an agreement with the Palestinians, his deep, profound desire to have peace, it reminds me of a story. When we first came to Montreal from Morocco, I was a little kid, and there weren't too many Sephardic Jews in Montreal. In fact, I had never met Ashkenazi Jews before. I didn't know they had Jews with 2 eyebrows. So I was a little kid, and I saw there's so many of them. Maybe I should become friends with them. And I love sports. So one of the things they love to play, they played this, I played soccer, and they played this other thing called football, where, the ball looks like this giant appetizer. And I had no idea what it was, but, I wanted to be friends with my Ashkenazi Jewish brothers. So I went to play a football game. And, I got into this thing called the huddle. And they had this quarterback who was saying, you flank here, you flank there, you buttonhole here, there, buttonhole. I had no idea what he was talking about. So I just sort of hung out and watched. And then something happened. The quarterback got injured. So they're all looking at me. This is one of those moments that comes back to haunt you when you're in a shrink's office 30 years later. They looked at me and they said, Suissa, you're the quarterback. So there I was, young Moroccan guy. I'm in the huddle, and I see 8 Ashkenazi guys with 2 eyebrows, and they're waiting on me to make a play, right? I got to call the play, and I have no idea what to say, but I want to look smart. So I look at them, and I come up with this brilliant idea. And I said, I got the play. Mitch, you go make a touchdown. That was the play. You go make a touchdown. So when I hear my friend Peter Beinart say, Israel, you go make a touchdown. You know what? I would love Israel to make a touchdown. It would be incredible. We've heard 1,000,000 times that it would be really, 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 really important for Israel to make peace. Peter's not the first person to say this. We keep hearing it over and over and over again. The idea of being Jewish and being democratic. This is not a new idea. And yes, it would be really amazing if we can have peace. It would be amazing. It would be amazing if Ahmadinejad became a Chabad rabbi and started loving every Jew. It would be amazing if Hamas opened up a Club Med in Gaza and thousands of Jews, of Israelis, would go there on the weekends. That would be amazing. It would be amazing if our peace partner, Mahmoud Abbas, would stop denying a Jewish connection to Jerusalem. That would be amazing. It would be amazing if Mahmoud Abbas decided to come to the peace table tomorrow morning. That would be great. But it's not the world we live in. It's not the reality we live in. The reality we live in is joy interrupted. This is the Jewish condition. We can never be completely joyful. There's always going to be something. And I remember we used to have a lot of joy in Montreal during Shabbat. And we lived in a neighborhood where there was these French-Canadian gangs, and the rumor was that they were, on the anti-Semitic side. And on Shabbat, my father liked when I wore a yarmulke. So out of respect for my father and for my Shabbat, I wore a yarmulke, and all these little Moroccan guys, we had our yarmulkes from bar mitzvahs. So they were orange and yellow and turquoise. We were pretty visible. And there I was. One day, I see something happening down the lane. One of my best friends is getting beat up. And I turn around, my brother's not there, my friends are not there, and I think, what am I going to do? They had 6 or 7 bums that were kicking this guy, my friend. So I can't go to my father, it's too late. So what do? Well, I was lucky because a week before my voice is broken and is pretty much sort of this big voice that I have now. It's just before my bar mitzvah, so I had that kind of voice that could scare babies from 2 miles away. And I ran. I ran towards the scene. And I made such noise with my voice. And I took some shots, because I knew I couldn't take on 6 or 7 guys, but I took some shots. And I gave some back. And I made so much noise and such a ruckus that neighbors started coming out and the bums started leaving. Thank you. That must be my family. Well, sometimes I look at that guy getting kicked. That's Israel. Has there ever been a country where the world obsesses over more than Israel? Has there ever been a country that is kicked more than Israel? Ever a country that is more condemned, more demonized, more boycotted than Israel? It's criminal, not just outrageous. It's criminal that this miracle in the desert, this flawed, imperfect miracle that Peter loved so much, it's criminal that this miracle country has become the world's most favorite and most popular punching bag. So what do you want me to do? Do you want me to join in and kick Israel while it's down, while it's being kicked by half of the world? Maybe I will. Maybe I will. If you can convince me that kicking Israel while it's down and joining the feeding frenzy will be good for the peace process. So now let me take off my Sephardic emotional hat and let me put on my Ashkenazi rational hat. And let's think about whether this obsession with the settlements that Peter articulates so eloquently, let's see whether that can really help the peace process. Let's just assume that all these negative conditions that I talked about, despite all of that, let's assume that it's still right to push for peace right now. In that case, if it's right to push for peace, the very last thing you want to do is malign the settlements. And I don't say this for ideological reasons or even biblical reasons. I say this for purely practical reasons. Negotiating 101. If you have nothing to offer, you will get nothing. Every time you malign a Jewish settlement, you reinforce the false narrative that this is stolen land. Just think about this. If I steal your car, what do you owe me? You owe me nothing. I just owe you to give you back your car with damages. And if I steal the land, what are my concessions really worth? Nothing. So this is right now the problem, is that Israel concessions have absolutely no value. Because on the other side, the narrative is that we stole the land. And if you steal the land, all you got to do is give it back. If Peter Beinart really wanted to help the peace process, he would help Israel make a legitimate claim for its rights in Judea and Samaria. And believe me, he's a smart guy, he can do it, but I brought a book for him. This land is my land, and he makes a really, really powerful case. At the very least, it makes a case that this is disputed territory and not occupied territory. And believe me, he would be helping Israel by giving its land concessions real value, because right now, they have no value. Now, doesn't that sound more reasonable than just maligning settlements? There's another Ashkenazi point, rational point I want to make about settlements. Peter goes on about, Israel is sort of gobbling up a future Palestinian state, as if we're encroaching on the possibility of a future Palestinian state, despite the fact that one of the anti-settlement organizations called B'Tselem, that says that the actual population of Jewish settlers is 0.99% of the West Bank, less than 1%. Now, of course, Israel controls 42% of the West Bank, which includes roads and infrastructure and sewers and bases and so forth, right? But we learned something from the evacuation of Gaza. We learned that it's a lot easier to evacuate sewers than it is to evacuate families. And families in the West Bank are in less than 1% of the West Bank. Less than 1%, 0.99%, and I brought the chart tonight. And then we talk about, well, settlement growth and the settlement growth. You know, there's an organization that is not known for being very pro-settlement. And I brought their chart too. Now, take a guess. How many new settlements have been built? I'm not talking about illegal outposts because I'm agreeing with Peter on illegal outposts. I will never defend anything that's illegal. But how many new settlements? In the last 14 years, how many new settlements? Just take a wild guess. Zero. You're right. Zero. So, but let's just grant to Peter. Let's say that despite all of that, let's just say that yes, maybe we are encroaching. But let's look at it logically. If we are encroaching, wouldn't that be a reason for Palestinians to hurry to the peace table? Because they're thinking, oh my God, they're encroaching on our future state. We better go back to the peace table. Well, you're wondering why that wouldn't happen, and I have an answer for you. And it comes from George Mitchell, President Obama's negotiator for several years. And this is what he said after Israel had done a 10-month moratorium on building in Judea and Samaria, a moratorium that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton called unprecedented. This is what George Mitchell said. The Palestinians opposed it on the grounds, in their words, that it was worse than useless. So they refused to enter into the negotiations until 9 months of the 10 had elapsed. Once they entered, they then said it was indispensable. What had been worse than useless a few months before then became indispensable, and they said they would not remain in the talks until that indispensable element were extended. That's our peace partners, all right? And that's where the peace process has been hiding for the past couple of years, paralyzed by a Palestinian demand that they themselves consider worse than useless. And despite all of that, Peter Beinart thinks that the way forward is for Jews to stop building bathrooms and bedrooms in Efrat. His big idea comes down to one big thing: more pressure on the Israelis. That is Peter Beinart's big thesis. We got to put more pressure on Israel regarding the settlements. This is not just an idea that hasn't worked. It's not just an idea that I consider misguided and counterproductive. It's also an approach that's insulting to the Palestinians. When you don't hold people accountable, you insult them by treating them like children. You make excuses for them. When Mahmoud Abbas denies any Jewish connection to Jerusalem, you treat him like a child by letting him off the hook. When he glorifies terrorists and allows the teaching of Jew hatred in his schools and summer camps, you insult him by not holding him accountable. When he refuses to prepare his people to compromise on the right of return and tell his people in public and in Arabic that there is absolutely no way that 5 million Palestinian refugees will ever come back to Haifa and Tel Aviv, you insult him by not telling him the truth in public. But why are we so afraid to tell them the truth? Well, you know, they're Palestinians. They're sensitive. They get hurt easy. That's an attitude that I find insulting and patronizing. And imagine how insulting it must be for Palestinians to see that Jews care only about the Palestinians that can do something for us. God forbid we'd have to worry about other Palestinians, the ones who are living in misery in Jordan and in Lebanon. But they can't give us a two-state solution. Where's the great liberal ethic? Where is it, that idea in the Torah that we should care for the other? It doesn't say in the Torah that we should care selectively for the other. It says that we should care for the other. But I never hear Jewish groups talk about the misery of the Palestinians in Lebanon and Jordan and other areas. This is not liberalism. This is a selfish tribal behavior that gives a black eye to the liberal ethic. And speaking of black eye, the approach of bashing Israel over settlements insults another group. It insults the millions of Israeli voters. Now think about it. Here we are in Pico Robertson in Hollywood and the Upper West Side of New York, and we're telling millions of Israeli voters, we know better than you what's good for you. We're David Suissa and Peter Beinart. We're pundits. It's not just our right to tell you what's good for you, it's our obligation. We know that you don't think now is the right time to take risks for peace. We understand that, okay? We know that you're afraid that Hamas is going to take over the West Bank. And if they do and they bring their 100,000 rockets, we know you're afraid that they're going to start raining all those rockets on Tel Aviv and Ben Gurion, and maybe, God forbid, hundreds and thousands of Jews will be murdered, because you've seen it happen already in Gaza. So we know you're afraid of that. And we know you saw what happened in Gaza when Palestinians took other Palestinians and threw them over and chopped their heads off. So we know you're afraid that what might happen if you give up the West Bank right now, and if you follow this idea of ending the occupation. We know why you're afraid. But we still want you to do it. Because we're pundits. We're pundits. We're American pundits. It's like a word for football or something. You pundit the ball. What a word. We're pundits. This is what we do. We tell Jewish voters that they're wrong, that we know what's good for them. Not only that, but we've read your Declaration of Independence, and Peter's read it very well. And right now, the image of Israel is not to his pleasure, especially that part about equality for all. Now, of course, Peter knows that Arabs in Israel have more rights, freedoms, and economic opportunities than any Arabs in the Middle East. He knows that. He knows that there are more NGOs per capita in Israel than any country in the world. He knows that. He knows that Israel is teeming with social activism and with the fight for social justice. He knows that. He knows that 200,000 kids from Gaza and West Bank were treated in Israeli hospitals over the past couple of years. He knows. He knows that what makes a great democracy is not whether or not it makes mistakes, but whether it has a corrective mechanism to handle those mistakes. And there are few countries that have a louder, noisier, healthier, more vigorous corrective mechanism than Israel. He knows all that, but he still says you're a democracy in crisis. If you look up the word crisis in Webster, it says something like the turning point of a disease, for better or for worse. He knows what Daniel Sokach of the New Israel Fund said, my friend Daniel, at Gerald Bubis' house, what he said to me one night. He says, David, all these NGOs that we support, that fight for the rights of women, for the rights of gays, for the rights of Ethiopians, for the rights of minorities, all these NGOs that we support is democracy in action. This is where democracy lives. Because when Peter quotes the Declaration of Independence, he forgets to quote a key line. And that line is, we will be a nation that loves peace, but also knows how to defend itself. And that's the struggle to balance competing ideals, competing forces, to balance the rights of a minority with the rights of a majority, to balance religion with state, to balance the fear for your children with a desire for peace. Is this struggle for balance that is the Jewish way. And in Israel, few countries have to go through that struggle more than Israel. And it goes through it every day, sometimes more successfully than others. Can you name any country that has experienced more anguish over moral questions? This is democracy. This is where democracy lives. Israel makes an enormous amount of mistakes. But I've been there 50 times over the years, and I will tell you this. Behind every mistake is a corrective mechanism in action. And it's that corrective mechanism where democracy lives. Now look, I want to end with one thing before we get into our fun conversation. Peter's made a big deal about the liberal Jews in America, about the new generation of liberal Jews who are not as connected to Israel. And it pains him. And this new generation, many of them, have been informed about Israel, their image about Israel, from what they've seen, when they've seen on campus. Israel being called baby killers, being called apartheid, boycott campaigns. They see in the news that Israel is continuously condemned. That is what has nourished them, the poison that has been unleashed on Israel. Has been a critical part of their education about Israel. So it hurts Peter, and that's what he wrote about 2 years ago. So his big idea is to pile on the criticism about the settlements. And I love Peter when I say this, but how can that work? How can you take someone who's already poisoned and make things worse and hope that it's going to make things better? How can you do that? But you know what's funny about all this is that if you read his famous article from the New England Review, from the New York Review of Books 2 years ago, in the very beginning of the article, he has himself, he writes the solution. He writes the better way. And nobody picked it up. The only media that picked it up was a Jewish journal. That's because it was in my column. And here's what he says. He quotes these focus groups that Frank Luntz did. And the focus groups were exactly this group of disconnected young liberal Jews. He quotes the groups and he said, you know, Frank Luntz, he showed him several ads, and there was one in particular. And Peter quotes only one headline in the article. There was only one. That was one of the most popular ads. That's the one he quotes. Take a guess what the ad was. It's 5 words. Does anybody know here? It hasn't been covered. The Jewish Journal is the only one that covered this. The ad that was the most popular was proof that Israel wants peace. That was the ad. Now, that's not criticism. That's not propaganda. That's context. Context. So what did Peter do? Did he run with this big idea? Well, not really. He wrote a book that essentially says proof that Israel doesn't want peace. He couldn't even follow his own advice. But I love that advice. I love the idea of proof that Israel wants peace. I love it because I owe him one. Because of everything he's written, it gave me an idea for my own book called The Zionist Spring. How Israel can turn the Middle East into the Middle East Spring. That was the idea I had, not just proof that Israel wants peace. My first question to you tonight was, how do we love Israel? What's the best way to love Israel? So now we have 2 options. Do we want 100,000 Jews going down Pico Boulevard bashing Israel over the settlements? Or do we want 100,000 Jews going down Pico Boulevard saying that Israel is the cure to the Middle East and not the curse? Which option do we want? Do we want 100,000 Jews bashing settlements, or do we want 100,000 Jews saying what Peter had in his article, proof that Israel wants peace? Which one do we want? I like the one, proof that Israel wants peace. I like it. So when you ask me, how do you want me to love Israel? What should I do? How do I express my love for Israel? Well, I want to continue the peace process. I want Bibi to send his private cell phone to Abbas and say, I want to meet you tomorrow morning, me and you, in a room. We lock it up, hummus, Turkish coffee, and let's make a deal. I want to do that. I want to go to Ramallah with Peter and speak to the Palestinians because they're the ones that need to hear this. They're the ones that need to hear come to the peace table. Bibi, you can say all you want about Bibi, Prime Minister Netanyahu, but he has said, I will go to the peace table. Now, if Peter thinks that Bibi is being disingenuous or not true, then why doesn't Abbas test Bibi? Why doesn't he call his bluff? Israel has been saying for 2 years, we're ready to speak now with no conditions. How much more clear can it be? How much more clear can it be? So yes, let's send our cell phone to Abbas from Bibi and let's have them meet right away. But in the meantime, until peace arrives, we should not sit and be paralyzed. We have a great message for the world, that Israel has gotten lessons for the past 64 years that are precisely what the Arab Spring craves. What are they asking for? We should show the world that we care not just about Palestinians, but we care about 400 million Arabs. And we have a know-how that can help those 400 million Arabs. Israel needs to be seen as a place, as a resource to help the world and to help the Middle East, not just as a failed state that can't reach peace. If you look at all the lessons that Israel has learned on how to deal with the desert and all this incredible experience and lessons that it's learned, Israel is the one that can make a difference. But instead of that, we're faced with this idea of Israel as a failed democracy, a democracy in crisis that needs to stop its settlement growth. It's disappointing. If I had to choose between the first and the second, the way I love Israel is by making Israel look the greatness that it really is. Thank you.
So now what I'd like to ask, Peter, if you would, there was a lot said just now, and I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond, and then the two of you dialogue for a bit, and then I have some questions that neither one of you has yet talked about. I'll rest.
Just sit here. Okay. Okay. First of all, on the idea that I'm demanding that Israel score a touchdown, I think that statement was clearly written before David had listened to my talk, because I explicitly said in my talk, I concede that a Palestinian state may be impossible. Let's just assume that it is. Let's assume that a touchdown is impossible. Let's just give Israel the possibility to still be on the field by not foreclosing the possibility of a viable contiguous Palestinian state with settlement growth, as Tzipi Livni, Ehud Olmert, Ehud Barak have all warned that Israel is doing. So I'm not asking Israel to score a touchdown. I'm simply asking us to keep alive the possibility of the two-state solution that is the only way that Israel can remain a democratic Jewish state. Whether that deal can be reached next week, or 2 years from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 20 years from now. On this rousing call that there should be negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, let me let you in on a little secret. There have been negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. Let me talk to you a little about them. First of all, Mahmoud Abbas was negotiating with Ehud Olmert in late 2008, and Olmert himself has said that Abbas was negotiating in good faith and that they were very close, and he urged Bibi to continue those negotiations. Abbas even negotiated during the Hasle, when Israel was at war with Hamas in Gaza. The Palestinians negotiated in 2010. Then there were several negotiations last year in 2011. There were several of them. They were in Geneva. There were some in Amman, and there were 5 meetings between the Israeli Palestinians as recently as January of this year. The truth is that the Palestinians are saying that they won't negotiate without a settlement freeze, but they in fact have been negotiating without a settlement freeze. They were negotiating without a settlement freeze with Olmert in 2008. What they've been trying to get is a statement from this Israeli government that it will negotiate along the parameters of 67 lines plus swaps, which was what Olmert was negotiating along those parameters, and what Barak was negotiating along those parameters. Because any negotiation which does not start with the idea that you're going to have to use the 67 lines as the baseline and then trade land is a meaningless negotiation. Barak understood that. Olmert understood that. What the Palestinians have been trying to do, and what Barack Obama was trying to do when he gave that speech in May 2011, where he said we should have negotiations along 67 lines plus swaps, and Abbas essentially said, yes, I would negotiate on those terms, and Netanyahu said very, very publicly no, is to see whether these are negotiations that have any chance of working. And I have to say, when Yuval Diskin, the guy who was the head of Israel's internal security service, in the first 2 years of this Israeli government, says, as explicitly as he did 2 weeks ago, this Israeli government has no interest in reaching a deal with the Palestinians. You know who else has said that? Benny Begin, who's one of the members of the internal 8-member inner cabinet of the Israeli government, has said this Israeli government's position is not 2 states. This is what Bughi Ayalon, the vice prime minister of Israel, also said to a group in Likud. We were trying to a Likud group in 2010. We were trying to bury the 2-state solution. So this is the central question today. Is the Israeli government willing to negotiate along the terms that its predecessor Ehud Olmert was negotiating along the lines of? Abbas has a proposal on the table for a 1.9% land swap. I'm not saying that Israel should take that. But this Israeli government has put no proposal on the table and has not even said that it would negotiate along the terms of the 67 lines. And in fact, I think there's very good reason to believe they're not within that ballpark at all. That's the reality we have to deal with. We want to show people that Israel wants peace. I think there have been many, many points in Israeli history where Israel has very, very badly wanted peace. And I think many, many Israelis very badly want peace, meaning a two-state solution along the lines that Bill Clinton proposed in December 2000 in the Clinton parameters. Unfortunately, this Israeli government so far is not in that category if we define peace as a two-state solution on the vast majority of the West Bank.
Maybe I'll speak while he's drinking.
I'm going to make a couple of other points. On the point that we treat the Palestinians like children when we say that there is a problem with settlement growth, I would really invite David to provide any evidence of any Palestinian who actually feels insulted at being told that settlement growth is a problem for Palestinians. If there is such a Palestinian, I have never met that person. It doesn't matter whether you call this occupied or disputed land and in what historical terms you talk about it. I said we have a very, very deep, precious connection to that part of the land. And our access to those holy sites is very, very important. I've said it before and I'll say it again. If in a Palestinian state, Jews were denied access to the cave of Machpelah, to Rachel's tomb in Bethlehem, to Shechem, where we believe that Joseph was buried, then the Israeli government and the American government should use pressure on the Palestinians to make sure that they live up to that, to a demand that I think Israel has every right to make. But the question is not whether Jews should live in the West Bank. It's a question of whether they should live as citizens next to Palestinian neighbors who don't have citizenship. And so it doesn't matter what you believe, which national group controls the land. What matters is that 1/3 of the settlements on the West Bank were built on individually owned Palestinian land. These are not the Palestinians as a national group. These are individual people. This is according to the Israeli Land Registry itself. That is a moral problem. That is an injustice that we should care about. It's true that Israel has built no new settlements. It's also true that, as David kind of waved it away, that there are roughly 100 illegal outposts all across the West Bank, some of which are being retroactively legalized and turned into Israeli settlements. It's also true that settlements make up less than 1% or whatever, roughly 1% of the land. But as David also acknowledged, the municipal area of the settlements is 10%, and the regional councils that encompass the settlements is 44%. So in fact, the amount of area that has been cordoned off for settlements is very, very large. And yes, Israel managed to evacuate in its largest military operation ever 9,000 settlers from Gaza. But according to Talia Sassoon, it would take, assuming that Israeli Jews are not willing to live under Palestinian control, which I think most probably would not, you would have to remove roughly 100,000 settlers from the West Bank. That's 10 times as many in an area that is much, much more biblically significant than is Gaza. This is not going to be a small thing for the Israeli government at all. In fact, we know that Ehud Barak, who after all became prime minister not long after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, right? The assassination of Yitzhak Rabin before Rabin had even talked about dividing Jerusalem. That Barak himself was very, very concerned about the possibility of civil war if he tried to remove enough settlements to create a contiguous, viable Palestinian state in the West Bank. And on this question about whether we know better, first of all, on the subject of whether American Jews have the right to criticize Israeli policy, here are some of the American Jews who believe that we do. Abe Foxman, whose group, the Anti-Defamation League, has been quite critical of some of the anti-democratic legislation in Israel's Knesset recently. David Harris, the head of the American Jewish Committee, who also has been. Malcolm Hoenlein, the head of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, who said publicly that if Israel were to divide Jerusalem, he would reserve the right to criticize it, I assume from the right. And think about it. If we don't have the right to criticize Israeli policy because we don't live there and we don't suffer the consequences of our actions, we don't live in Sderot or Tel Aviv, well, I've got news for you. We don't live in Ramallah or Gaza City either. So by what basis do we have to criticize the Palestinians, which we do morning, noon, and night? Because we don't live in their territories either. We don't live the consequences of their actions either. Nor do we live in the former Soviet Union, Nor did we live in the former Soviet when Jews were, thank God, out in the streets demanding that they let Jews go free. Nor were we when Jews rallied against genocide in Bosnia or Darfur. The American Jewish community spends a lot of time criticizing countries in which we don't live because we have moral perspectives about what happens in those countries, and they're all the more so about Israel, about which we care, I would hope, more than any other country. And as for the and on the question of whether Israel can afford to create a Palestinian state, again, I said, even if you don't think it can, we still have to maintain the possibility by stopping settlement growth and stopping these subsidies. But it's worth noting that every single former head of Mossad and Shin Bet, who has publicly spoken, and every single former head of the Israel Defense Forces, except for one, is publicly in support of a Palestinian state near the 1967 lines, right? These are not people who spend their time at Zabar's on the Upper West Side or whatever the Los Angeles equivalent is. Forgive my cultural illiteracy. These are pretty hard-headed people. People like Yuval Diskin and Mayor Dagan, who have recently been scathing in their criticism of this government for not taking the opportunity to make possible a two-state solution or at least keep it alive. So I guess my question for David is, what does he know that they don't know? Since the vast majority of the heads of the former Israeli security establishment essentially support a Palestinian state near the 1967 lines. As it turns out, in my book, I offer two proposals in terms of dealing with younger American Jews. One of them had to do with Jewish schools, which I think is absolutely central to creating a connection between American Jews and Israel, because I think one of the reasons it's hard for younger American Jews to be connected to Israel is because too many of them are not connected to anything Jewish. And that's because we are one of the wealthiest and most Judaically illiterate communities in the history of the Jewish people. And we tell young American Jewish families, you know what, the most important thing you could possibly do is create a commitment to the Jewish people among your children. But, oh, by the way, if you want to send your kids to a full-time Jewish school, well, you have to take out a second mortgage on your house. And the school, we don't even know if it's going to be around there in 3 years because it's in such bad financial shape and they have no gym and no science lab. Not true for this school, but for many, many Jewish schools. And then we say, but go for it. It's the most important thing you can do. So in fact, I take that problem very seriously. But in terms of the other question, which is the alienation that young American Jews feel about Israeli policies, these people are not fools. They're not people who you're going to win over by better hasbara. They, in fact, are a generation that has more access to more of its own sources of information than any in history. And when you take them on birthright trips, I love the idea that young American Jews get to go to Israel, but when you take them on birthright trips and you never introduce them to Palestinians, and then you try to tell them that Israel has always wanted peace and always will want peace, as David wants to do, but you decline to mention the fact that the Shin Bet director from this own government said this government is not interested in cutting a deal with the Palestinians. That's the best way to alienate them, because it's actually intellectually insulting. It seems to me that the best thing we can do to connect them to Israel, besides connecting them to Judaism, is in fact to struggle for an Israeli political leadership that actually is willing to take the hard decisions for peace and for the preservation of Israel as a democratic Jewish state, and invite them to be part of that struggle for Israeli democracy, because they are implicated in it. Because if Israel collapses as an ethical project, if Israeli democracy dies, it will have as profound an impact on their lives as did the creation of the State of Israel for their parents and grandparents. And we should urge them to be part of that struggle.
Can you hear me? You know, Peter's failed to answer all the important questions. First thing he said was that they have all these negotiations going on. I read every paper every day. Where are these negotiations? They're not covered in Haaretz. They're not covered in J-Post. Where are these sort of shadow negotiations?
Read the International Crisis Group report.
I read it. I read it all the time.
It talks about that.
Well, I didn't interrupt you, but I love you anyway. All right, good.
Sorry, no more interruptions. I apologize.
All right. So I don't know what he's talking about. When I say negotiations, I mean what happened with Abbas and Olmert. That's what I'm talking about. And for the past 2.5 years, they've stayed away. Now, he's making a big deal that they only have one condition, the 67 lines. That's false. They keep saying right up until last week, we won't come back to the negotiating table until Israel stops its settlements and has a settlement freeze. So Peter forgot to tell you that. Now, Israel also had a condition last year. Their condition was, you have to first agree on the right to a Jewish state. And the Palestinians never agreed to that. Now, the right to a Jewish state, is that any less important than stopping to build bathrooms and kindergartens in Efrat? Why is that less important? And still, Israel decided not to have that precondition. And still, Israel said, I'm ready to talk tomorrow morning. Now, he's going to quote a lot of former disgruntled. You know, it's a big thing in Israel. You have former disgruntled, people that Bibi didn't promote. And he's going to give you all kinds of quotes that Bibi doesn't want to make peace. That's disingenuous. Bibi has said, I'm ready to meet right now with no preconditions. And Peter's turning himself into a pretzel to try to explain the Palestinian position of why Mahmoud Abbas has not come to the peace table with Bibi. That's what I'm talking about. And that's the touchdown that I'm talking about. That's my dream. My dream is that they start making a deal. And it's not happening. And Peter did not address that question. Why is Mahmoud Abbas not coming to the peace table with Bibi right now? And Bibi has offered. He's ready to speak right now. And that's the question he cannot answer, because the answer is too painful. So that's one thing. Second thing is what he was saying about the idea that I, for some reason, happen to believe that American Jews have no right to criticize Israel. He's got to read my columns in the Jewish Journal. I have criticized Israel relentlessly. I criticize Israel all the time. For me, Peter, for you to say about me that I believe you guys don't have the right to criticize, that's ridiculous. We have the right to criticize. All I'm doing is I'm making a distinction between a right and an obligation. So if I have the right to have a march of 100,000 Jews criticizing Israel, I have that right. But does that mean I have to do it? The question is one of priorities. What's the priority right now? What can we do here in Israel, in America, to help Israel? Does Israel look like a country that needs more arguments, that needs more pressure? Don't you think there's enough pressure in Israel going on right now, within Israel, to create a two-state solution, to have peace with the Palestinians? There's an enormous amount of pressure internally in that country already. So my role as a supporter of Israel, is my role to sort of pile on that pressure? Or is it my role to sort of provide perspective and context if I feel that young liberal American Jews have been poisoned on Israel? Is my role to pile on, or is my role to provide context? And you know, when Peter talks about proof that Israel wants peace, there's a great story there. Compare the last speech of Yitzhak Rabin in the Knesset. And Yitzhak Rabin is one of the great heroes of the peace movement. Compare his last speech on his vision of a two-state solution in the Knesset, and compare that to the last offer that Ehud Olmert made to the Palestinians, to Mahmoud Abbas, a few years ago. It's like the beginning and the end of an auction at Sotheby's. The first bid and the last bid. It is a staggering increase in Israeli concessions from one to the next. That's proof that Israel wants peace. So when Peter goes out of his way to show us that maybe they don't really want peace, that's disingenuous and it's not fair. Israel has made so many concessions. Israel has made one concession after another. It's taken risks for peace. Israel has offered to end the occupation many times. Ehud Olmert offered to dismantle 60 to 100,000 settlers. He offered it. But for some reason, Peter's trying to explain to you, well, you know, maybe it wasn't a good enough offer. But the truth is that they always said no. And they've been saying no since 1948. We should rename them the Palestinos. So all they do is say no. And why should they not say no? Because the more they say no, the more concessions we make. They have an incentive to keep saying no. But it's not right. Now, I'm not happy to say all this. This is not pleasant for me. I wish I could sit here and tell you, well, they've been saying yes and they're ready to say yes. But that's not what we've seen. So what's there to do now going forward? What's there to do now is to put pressure on the Palestinians to come to the peace table. That's what needs to happen. Peter needs to go to Ramallah and put pressure on the Palestinians to come to the peace. They need the pressure. Putting more pressure on Israel hasn't helped. So I say this for the sake of peace. I say this for the sake of Peter's goal, to have a two-state solution. If he's really serious about that goal, the pressure should be on the Palestinians to come back to the peace table tomorrow morning.
I guess I would just say really briefly, the point I was trying to make is that the Palestinians actually have been negotiating. It's true, it hasn't gotten a huge amount of press, but in fact, if you look at the International Crisis Group report, which is a very, very comprehensive report about what's happened in the peace process over the last few years, it mentions the fact, and my own reporting in my book also talks about this, and it's been in the Israeli papers too, it's not a secret, that there were a series of meetings between the Palestinians and the Israelis in 2011, and then again under the auspices of King Abdullah in Jordan early this year. And the central question, which has really dominated things since Obama's speech in May 2011, when Obama tried to get negotiations started, was, are these negotiations going to be within the same parameters that Omer was negotiating? I mean, you can't both simultaneously praise Omer for the fact, and I do praise Omer. I think Omer.
There were no preconditions.
Yeah, but the point is, my point is that the Palestinians.
There were no preconditions.
Yeah, my point is the Palestinians were negotiating without preconditions. They were saying that the settlement free had to be a precondition, but in fact they were negotiating without preconditions.
So why won't they do it now?
January, because the problem is that their proposal for a 1.9% land swap has been met by Israel with not only no land proposal at all, but not even a willingness to say that we're going to discuss it within the parameters of 67 lines plus swaps. And so these will be negotiations that will be meaningless. The reason the Palestinians negotiated endlessly with Omer without a settlement freeze was because they had good reason to believe he was serious. Unfortunately, we haven't seen that, and I think that's why you say that you talk about how Israel made this great progress from Rabin to Omer. I totally agree. I think what Omer did was really heroic. The problem is that progress really hit a brick wall. Remember, Benjamin Netanyahu came into office explicitly opposed to a Palestinian state, any Palestinian state. It wasn't until June 2009 that he even uttered the word. And then his own father, and now repeated cabinet ministers, have said, actually, that he doesn't mean a Palestinian state along the same parameters that Barak and Omer did. He said there would be no Israeli leaving of the Jordan Valley, for instance.
So
which
listen,
is explicit. Well, I did one interruption. You do one interruption. I'll be brief. I'll be brief. It seems to me that the idea that you are going to get the Palestinians to make greater concessions, right? David said that we have to treat the Palestinians like grown-ups. Okay. Well, the major demand that actually we made of this Palestinian leadership in the West Bank, in the Bush administration, was that they do real security cooperation with Israel to try to do something about the horrific terrorism of the Second Intifada. Israel's own military leaders have said that the Palestinians in the West Bank are actually doing a pretty good job of that. The security barrier is doing part of it, but I've got news for you. The security barrier has huge gaps in it. It doesn't cover the entire of Israel. The other big reason that there's been less terrorism, thank God, has been because of the really good security cooperation between Israel and the Palestinians. So the Palestinians actually did fulfill the most significant demand that was made for them in the roadmap. The question is, what about Israel's demand? What about Israel's obligation under the roadmap to freeze settlement growth and to deal with the illegal outposts? Yes, there was a 10-month settlement freeze, which started into late 2009 and went into the fall of 2010. The problem was that in 2010, the year of the settlement freeze, there was more settlement growth than there had been in 2008 because the settlement freeze had a loophole which allowed you to continue building on buildings from which the foundations had been built. So what all the Israeli newspapers noted was that there was a huge building of foundations in the period leading up to the settlement freeze, and then the building upon those foundations, and then the laying of new foundations after those 10 months. And that's why there was actually more settlement growth during 2010 than during 2008. You would need a settlement growth that extended longer than 10 months to really actually start to deal with just the rate of growth in settlements. And the Palestinians eating up more and more of the West Bank, making the possibility of a contiguous Palestinian state harder and harder, is not going to make the Palestinians make more concessions. It's going to push more and more Palestinians into saying, you know what? Maybe we would have accepted this 78-22% split, right? Israel gets 78% of British mandatory Palestine, we get 22%. But actually, it's not even going to be 22%. It's going to be significantly less than that. So you know what? Forget about it. The birth rate is on our side. The world is increasingly on our side. let's just have the 100-year struggle for the character of that one state, and ultimately we will succeed in divesting it of its Jewish character. And that's what frightens me.
Listen to what Peter just said.
David, can I ask you a question based on that? But you say what you're going to say, and then I want to ask you.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi. Listen to what he just said. Remarkable, all right? For the first time ever, a Likud prime minister agreed to a two-state solution. And the response of the Palestinians was, I still don't trust you. Instead of rewarding Netanyahu, he got rewarded by saying, I don't trust you and I'm still not coming to speak. Now, that's incredible. And there's no answer for that. There is no excuse for the Palestinians not to come to the negotiating table. As far as the security cooperation, I'm glad he brought it up, because I met a Palestinian in Ramallah who had a very interesting view on the situation. When I told him if he wanted the Israeli presence to end in the West Bank, you know what he told me? He told me it's not occupation, it's protection. The Israeli army is protecting us from Hamas. That's why we've been so successful here, because they're protecting us. So there's two ways to look at this. Of course, a dream of a two-state solution is a great dream. But what Peter keeps not referring to is he keeps saying that it's getting worse and worse, but it's not. It's still in the 1%. This idea that we keep encroaching land, even if it was true, should be an incentive for the Palestinians to come back into the negotiating table. But it's not true. It's not true that most of the building, like Makovsky said, the great majority, if not all of it, happens up and in. Up and in means it's not increasing the footprint of the West Bank. It's under 1%. 0.99% of the West Bank is full of Jews, Jewish settlers. How is that encroaching on a future Palestinian state? Thank you, Rabbi.
My question to you, David, is if push came to shove, and this has been now 44 years since the West Bank has been held by Israel, and there's been no settlement and no two-state solution. If this keeps going in this direction, what would you prefer, a Jewish state or a democratic state? And if there ever were to be in conflict with each other, how would you reconcile the fact that at some point between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, there will be more Arabs living in that area than Jews, and that most of them will be in the military administration, will not be granted the same rights as Israeli Arabs who live within the Green Line and Israeli citizens? Which would you be prepared to support first, a democratic state, or which would mean the end of a Jewish state, or a Jewish state, which would mean the end of democracy?
Well, I'm going to do something very Jewish. I'm going to ask another question.
But you will answer that one, too.
I will answer. Let's say I told you that if you project that scenario, that you find out that the amount of Palestinians is actually only 30 or 33%. Let's say it's not 51%. Let's say you find out that it's not going to be a problem, that you still have a Jewish majority, even with the Palestinians in the West Bank, because there's some evidence that they overstated the amount of Palestinians by over 1 million. And Gaza is already out of the picture. So what would happen? Peter, I'm asking you this. What would you do, Peter, if in fact there were less Palestinians than 51%? There were 30% Palestinians, even within the West Bank, and we can give citizenship to all those Palestinians in the West Bank, as per the Declaration of Independence. They would have the same rights. What would you do?
Okay, I think the question was thrown from David to me, but that's okay. First of all, I would challenge the premise. Gaza is not out of the picture. Gaza is under Israeli occupation according to the United States government. The United States government defines Gaza as under Israeli occupation because Israel controls access to Gaza by land and by air and by sea, and also by land from Israel. It's true you can get through Egypt. Israel also has a security perimeter inside the Gaza Strip, which takes control of about 30% of the farmland inside the Gaza Strip and puts it off limits to Gaza. In fact, Israel just this week, for the first time in 5 years, allowed Palestinians in Gaza to export Palestinian-made clothing from the Gaza Strip. So it's true that while there are no settlers in Gaza anymore, Israel is still the occupying force. So you can't just say that Gaza is not part of the issue. Gaza is still under Israeli occupation, unless you want Egypt to take it. I don't think that's very likely to happen. Look, for me,
the question of birth rate and demographics, I think that in some ways for me is not that central. You know, if you were to have a smaller Palestinian population, but it would be 30% or 40% to give those people citizenship, it would still be, it seems to me, a far, far less good outcome than giving Palestinians citizenship in their own state, because the nature of the state of Israel would dramatically change in ways that I think would make it much less of a Jewish state. I ultimately think if you get to the choice between Israel, in a one-state solution between Israel as a Jewish state and Israel as a democratic state, in a way, I believe ultimately you get to the same place no matter what. Which is to say, even if you were to say you wanted Israel to remain a Jewish but non-democratic state, you say, you know what, forget about the democracy, those guys who wrote the Declaration of Independence were wrong. Ultimately, just putting aside the moral horror of that, right, the moral horror of that, even in the most cold-blooded, purely pragmatic way, you're ultimately going to lose. Israel, I do not believe, is going to be able to sustain itself permanently as a non-democratic Jewish state. It will become, God forbid, it will become South Africa. It will become a pariah state in a world where America has less power to protect it.
Well,
and that ultimately will mean that Israel is divested of its Jewish character, and it will become a democratic state, although in reality, I think what a binational state would in fact be a very, very bloody civil war.
Well, let me push it this way. Let me ask you this question. What if within Israel proper, without the West Bank, what if the Palestinians with a higher birth rate end up to be 50 and 60%? What do? Do you get rid of them?
No. I think that what Israel has to do with its Arab citizen population is what Yitzhak Rabin did, which is reach out to that population. Rabin built dozens of health clinics in Arab villages. He instituted affirmative action for the civil service of Israel's government. He equalized the childhood allowances for Arab and Jewish families.
Why can't you do that for the Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank?
Well, the Palestinian Arabs have a much more fundamental structural problem, which is they're not even citizens to begin with. But the point
once you make them citizens.
Okay, but the point I was trying to make here about your question, which is what do you do with Israel's Arab citizens, is I think, in fact, if you look at Sami Smuhad at University of Haifa's polling, you see that the sense of feeling that Arab Israeli citizens have about the state is influenced by how the state treats them. Right? There's no reason that they need to always to get the short end of the stick when it comes to government services. In fact, there's no reason that Israel has to have a de facto rule that there could be no Arab parties in the government. Israel says, well, we can't. You have to have a Jewish majority in the Knesset. Why? Because the Arab parties are not Zionist. Well, I've got news for you. Some of the Haredi ultra-Orthodox parties are not really that Zionist either, and they get included in the government coalition. So there are a whole series of things you could do, it seems to me, to begin to change the very frightening and very, very worrying sense of alienation that Israel's Arab citizens have from the Israeli government. That could begin to start to bring together this problem. I just want to say just one quick thing, though, about this idea of up and in, because I feel like I can't let it go. This idea that basically all this settlement growth is not really a problem because basically these are all just in consensus settlements. Even if that were true, even putting aside all those illegal outposts that are very deep, let's just talk for a second about some of these consensus settlements, because this is frankly the problem of the American Jewish community talking only to itself, right? Is we always say everyone knows A, B, and C, except everyone turns out not to be the Palestinians, right? So one of the biggest consensus settlements is the settlement of Ariel, the fourth largest settlement, 20,000 people. They have a university there now. It's not near the Green Line. It stretches 13 miles into the West Bank. Shlomo Ben-Ami has said it makes Palestinian contiguity very difficult because look at a map. David brought some map. Look at the Palestinian cities of Kilkilia and Tulkarem, right on the Green Line in the West Bank. And then imagine that you have to drive 13 miles out into the West Bank to get to all the other cities in the West Bank. Let's talk about Efrat, which he mentioned. Efrat. What could be more consensus than Efrat? Well, it turns out that the Geneva Agreement of 2003, which is the only agreement signed by former Israeli-Palestinian negotiators, they actually call for Israel to dismantle Efrat. Why? Because Efrat cuts off Route 60, the north-south corridor that actually is the main thoroughfare between the northern and southern West Bank. So let's not fool ourselves here. Sending even more people to places like Efrat and Ariel is a very, very serious problem for the two-state solution, partly because of the contiguity problems, partly because I've got another little dirty secret for you. Israel doesn't have an infinite amount of land inside the Green Line to trade for all of these settlements. There's a demographer at Ben Gurion who suggested that in order to get up to the 5 or 6 or 7% land swap, Olmer talked about 6.3%. You might have to move Israeli Jews off of their land inside the Green Line, so you had enough high-quality land to trade for those settlements. So let's not tell ourselves that there's no cost to subsidizing more and more people to move into the West Bank.
Okay, David, thank you. David, I'm sensing discomfort in your responding to my question.
No.
Because you answered the question with a question. If it push came to shove, would you support a democratic state, which would mean from the Mediterranean to the sea, including Gaza, because I think Peter's right, that you can't separate Gaza from the Palestinian reality, or a Jewish state?
It's a non-answer. It's a non-question, because there is no choice to be made. I don't consider Judaism and democracy to be ever separated. For me, they're always going to be connected. So I could never imagine.
Then what that means is granting full rights. Never. What that means that you're saying is that Israel needs to grant full citizenship to Arabs living in the West Bank and in Gaza.
Well, if it gets to that point, like I said before, what happens if we have to do what Peter was saying about treating the Arab citizens of Israel? I completely agree with him in terms of integrating them and giving them more, better, full rights. Totally agree. And they should even have the responsibility to go to the army. I think it's discrimination, not that they should not do their share in defending the country. So I'm totally agreeing with that. But my question that he did not answer is if that's going to work inside of Israel, which means you're sort of earning their loyalty, so that even if there's a lot of them, they're still loyal to you, then why would that not work in the West Bank either? And that's a problem that you're going to get whether or not you keep the West Bank. But I do want to do one thing that I promised myself I would do, because I knew that, Peter goes on and on and on about the settlements. And I have a thing here from the Beinart that says, from this year, government to withhold aid from settlements. Ministers decide to exclude 70 West Bank settlements from national priorities map, and the story was covered up. And the government has decided to exclude 70 West Bank settlements from the list of national priority areas, which basically grants benefits aimed at boosting the community's economy and making them more attractive to new residents and investors. And here's the reaction of the head, Yesha Council Chairman Danny Dayan. Here's his reaction. It's a grave decision, blatantly discriminating against the West Bank settlements.
Peter, I have a question for you based on concerns about justice. Assuming a two-state solution, roughly along the Green Line with swaps, and the issue of Israel remaining a democratic, just state, what would justice demand with regards to Palestinians and the right of return who lost their homes in 1948 and 1967? How would you address that concern, which is a very big concern to the Palestinians? How do you compensate or bring justice to them for, and I think it's important to state that, as Benny Morris has written in 1948, in his book 1948, that many Palestinians fled on their own out of fear. Others were driven off by the Haganah and Israel Defense Forces deliberately. And some were, in certain areas, some of the Arabs who were driven off, it was just a tactical decision on the spot that the Israeli military forces made. But still, you have a lot of Arabs, 200,000 people, maybe 300,000, directly who left, who no longer have their homes. What does justice demand that they receive? And by the way, I should say that there's an equivalent number of Jews who were forced out of Arab countries too, and who lost everything. So I mean, one could argue there's a swap to be made, but that doesn't deal with the individuals involved.
Yeah, well, right. David's family is from Morocco. My own grandmother is from Egypt. So both of us have our life histories connected by that. I think the fundamental distinction is that, I speak for my own family, I think most Sephardi Jews in Israel don't want to go back to those countries. They want to actually live in Israel. On the question of, I think it's also worth noting in terms of this history of 1948, something not often mentioned in the Jewish community, that a very significant number of those Palestinians who left in 1948 left whether they were fled or driven out or whatever, left even before the Arab armies attacked, right? I mean, a significant, perhaps close to half of that happened even before the war between Israel and the Arab armies began. Look, unlike some in the American Jewish community, I would not belittle the Palestinian connection to that historic territory, even for children and grandchildren who were not born there. We, as Jews, it seems to me, we prayed to return to Israel for 2,000 years. So we shouldn't belittle people who can't forget about their homes after 60 years or 70 years. We should. I don't like that.
Please, ladies and gentlemen.
As someone who descends from those Jews,
You know what? Forgive me. I'm the prerogative of the chair, which is me, that we're having a trialogue here. I am asking questions from both sides of this, and please let them respond and no yelling at.
And I'm happy to talk afterwards if you'd like. I'll be around. Look, the problem of the refugee issue is twofold. Partly it's symbolic. I think the Palestinians want recognition of the suffering that they went through in Israel's War of Independence. A War of Independence that was for us a miracle. My son and daughter still can't stop singing Hatikva because they have been doing so much Yom HaAtzmaut celebrations at their school. Of course, it was a miracle for us, a great blessing. It was a catastrophe for them. And there should be an acknowledgement of their suffering. Doesn't even have to get into this question of essentially all the details of what happened. I think the acknowledgement of their suffering, I think, is important. And I don't think threatens Israel at all. On the practical question, the problem is that these keys that people have, those homes don't exist anymore. Those villages and towns don't exist anymore. There's no place to go back to. Israel is a Jewish state now. And so it doesn't seem to me it's in the interest of those Palestinian refugees to go back to a Jewish state where their communities, both in general, don't really exist anymore. I think that you could have some small-scale right of return. In fact, Barak and Omer were both open to the idea of some small number, maybe in the tens of thousands of people who could return. I said they wanted them to be original refugees, which I think makes all the sense in the world. According to the Palestine papers, actually, the Palestinian position in the Omer negotiations was that they wanted 150,000. Now, 150,000 is a lot higher than any Israeli government has offered. It may be higher than even I would want Israel to accept. But it's worth noting that just demographically, even if you accepted 150,000, if you gave away the Palestinian neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, you would essentially be still lowering, in terms of a demographic issue, there would actually be more Palestinians leaving the state of Israel than coming in, just by getting rid of East Jerusalem. I think the best answer is to have some a statement of recognition of suffering and some small-scale right of return in the tens of thousands over a series of years by original refugees, and then have a massive effort by the international community, led by the United States, to resettle people within a Palestinian state. And I think it seems to me that would be a bitter pill for some of them to swallow, but it would allow them to have the dignity and rights of statehood, which I think is the most important thing. And then for the question of justice for the Jews from Arab land, I think that's also an important issue. And I don't oppose any effort to try to think about whether there are ways of Jews getting lost property from North Africa or the Middle East, but the Palestinians are not responsible for that problem. And essentially to make dealing with the Palestinian refugee problem and the two-state solution contingent on getting Iraq and Iran and Morocco and Egypt and whatever to deal with those problems, seems to me they should be dealt with as separate issues.
David, do you want to respond to that?
Please, I do.
Okay.
Because I think Peter missed the most important point, which is the emotional idea of preparing yourself for compromise. So he's getting into the nitty-gritties of 150, 20,000. But the biggest problem is that there's a psychology of victimhood among the refugees, and that they've never been prepared to compromise. So you got millions and millions of refugees who, for them, assume that they're always going to go back. So this is the biggest mistake that's been made in this whole peace process. And what I encourage Peter and everybody else to do who wants peace in the Middle East is to pressure the Palestinians to start speaking the truth to their people. The truth is, there is no way that 4 to 5 million refugees will ever go back to Israel. And that truth is never spoken. You can have meetings inside offices that say, sure, we'll compromise. But what are they saying in Arabic to their people and in public? We went public, the Israelis did. Many, many years ago, we didn't accept a Palestinian state. But over the years, we were prepared for major painful compromises. We got to the point where now we do make and have offered major compromises. But that hasn't happened on the other side. And that's why it pains me to see that Peter's approach is to continue pressuring just one side, because it's not going to work for peace. The only approach that will work for peace is if we put a lot more pressure on the Palestinians to speak the truth about the impossibility of 4 million Palestinians returning to Israel.
But what does it mean to say the Palestinians have not made any compromises? In 1993, the PLO accepted Israel's right to exist, not in return for a Palestinian state. They didn't get a Palestinian state in 1993. All they got in return for accepting Israel's right to exist was Israel's recognition of the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. According to Ehud Olmert, Abbas made this offer of accepting Israel's right to exist and Jewish control over all the Jewish neighborhoods of East Jerusalem except for Har Homa, and a 1.9% land swap, an international force in the Jordan Valley, a non-militarized Palestinian state, Israeli access to the telecommunications spectrum, to the airspace. Now, are there Palestinians who reject that? Absolutely. Do we know that ultimately a Palestinian leadership would sign and could get it through? Of course we don't know that. But just simply to say the Palestinians have made no compromise.
That's not what I said. I talked about the right of return.
Okay, on the right
They
of
have
return,
not prepared their
problem.
people.
Here's the
The right
problem
of return.
here's the problem with the right of return. The problem with telling the Palestinians that there's going to be no right of return is if you're going to make it work politically, you have to have something that they're going to get in response, right? If you go to the refugee camps and say, you're not going back, yes, you were lied to, you're not going back. But here's what you have. You have a state of your own, with your own flag and your own national anthem, and it has a capital in Jerusalem. Then you have a chance of making that deal stick. If you go to the Palestinians and say, basically, there's going to be no refugee return.
Ehud Olmert offered that, Peter.
Yes, he offered a 6.3% land swap, and Abbas offered a 1.9% land swap. And Olmert has said if you continue those negotiations, you might have worked to a common agreement. Yes, you can't always just say, because the Palestinians don't accept the Israeli offer, that they said no.
When did they make an offer? When did they make an official
Abbas has an
offer that was
offer on
public?
the table right
that
now.
was public. When was there an
There's
offer?
a 1.9% land swap offer on the table right now.
That's not true.
It is true. They've offered the maps to the Israelis and to the Americans. So the point I'm trying to make is, it's like asking Israel to give up East Jerusalem, but to say, just give up East Jerusalem right now because you know you're going to have to do it eventually. Israelis are going to say, what are we going to get in return for this extremely painful concession? That's the political bargain with the Palestinians. You're going to have to get them to give up on refugee right of return. If you can, you're going to have to be able to show them that they're getting something in response. To say that they should do it and get nothing, it seems to me just not politically realistic. No more politically realistic than expecting Israel to give up East Jerusalem without getting anything in return.
But it's ridiculous to say that they would get nothing. The Israelis have made one offer after another that's got a lot more than something. It's got an incredible offer that they never responded to.
David, could you be specific? What would you be prepared to that, not you, but what do you think that Israel should be prepared to compromise in the event that there is a legitimate coming together of the two sides?
I'm ready to make so many compromises for true peace. Whether it's 10,000, 20,000, those are small details for me. The really important point is that peace is not a goal. Peace is a result of education. And it's not a question that you're going to go negotiate with these numbers. It's a question of you have to prepare for peace. And if you have a population that has in their mind for decades and decades and decades that they will never compromise on the right of return, how is that preparing them for reconciliation? How is that preparing them for peace?
David, what about Jerusalem? What should Israel be prepared to do to compromise with regards to Jerusalem, if anything, in your view?
Look, that's very complicated, Rabbi, because you got...
I know, that's why I'm asking you.
Take a guess. How many Jews are in East Jerusalem? Take a guess. 5,000, 10,000? How many Jews in East Jerusalem?
More and more all the time.
200,000.
200,000. 200,000 Jews in East Jerusalem. So when we talk about, Jerusalem, you look at the Palestinians themselves in East Jerusalem, 60% of them don't want to go to a Palestinian state. They want to stay in Israel. because of all the benefits that they get from Israel.
In
So-
principle, should there be a Palestinian capital in Jerusalem, according to your position?
I don't think so, because I don't think it's going to work. I don't think it's, if I thought it would work, Rabbi, I would say yes. But I don't think it's going to work. I think what you'll have is you'll have real civil war. And I think what Israel has shown is that it's brought peace to Jerusalem on both sides in terms of the protection of all the religions and so forth. So I think it's a bad idea.
But you can't have it both ways. You can't praise Omer and Barak for being willing to offer a deal which allows a Palestinian state in East Jerusalem, and then say that you oppose a Palestinian state with a capital in East Jerusalem. You have to either say you were opposed to those offers, or stop praising them. But it seems to me you're trying to have it both ways.
No, I think that's wrong. I think that's wrong. The point I was making is the good faith of Israel. That's the point I was making. Israel was coming from a place of good faith, from a place of very painful compromises. I might not agree with some of those compromises, but you can't dispute that these were very painful compromises. And that's my point. And I'd like to see painful compromises on the other side. And I think at that point, that's when we'll have a chance for reconciliation.
Peter, I have a tough question for you. And nobody has said a word about it, about your proposal about boycotting West Bank settlements. What would such a, and for those of you who don't know, Peter came out in the New York Times calling for a boycott of the West Bank settlements. What would such a boycott look like, and how do you respond to critics who say that your call plays into the hands of Israel haters and delegitimizers of Israel?
Thanks. Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about it. I think we need to change the incentive structure that makes it cheaper very often for Israelis to live in the West Bank and to live within Green Line Israel, because I think that incentive structure, as I said earlier, I think seriously imperils Israel's future as a democratic Jewish state. I was inspired by David Grossman and Amos Oz and Aleph Bet Yehush, who are three of Israel's greatest writers, and I think of three of its foremost democracy activists, who said they would not perform in the cultural center in Ariel because they believed, as I do, that this imperils Israel's future as a democratic Jewish state. And so I believe, I made this argument that we need to distinguish between the way we treat what I call democratic Israel, the Israel that, to its enormous credit, given the extreme strain that it's been under, has in fact maintained the right of citizenship to all people, and what I call non-democratic Israel, the parts of Israeli control where roughly 80% of the population is denied citizenship, the right to vote, lives under a different legal system. And in fact, it's funny, it may sound like a very radical proposal, but at least you know who has essentially been operating along that principle for many, many years, at least de facto? The federation system. In fact, the federation system basically does not spend its money over the Green Line, because they see, and I didn't even say, by the way, I excluded East Jerusalem from my proposal. I'm only talking about the West Bank outside of East Jerusalem. But there actually is, in very, very established mainstream American Jewish institutions, a recognition that we should have a distinction between the way we respond to democratic Israel and non-democratic Israel. I think that if people think, I also feel like this proposal, which is not simply a boycott of products from the West Bank, but is also involves an affirmation of the products and services of democratic Israel, which is to say, in my vision, essentially, if you were not going to buy something made in a settlement, you would proactively go out and buy that same product or some product from within democratic Israel, also gives people an opportunity to affirm Israel's right to exist while opposing the settlements. Because my great fear is, what's happening is, the BDS movement, which wants to boycott all of Israel, and I think is essentially one statist in character, is gaining ground because they're offering people the chance to do something, to make some kind of statement of opposition. And the American Jewish community essentially is not giving them any opportunity to basically say that they think settlements are a problem. And so what's happening is, over time, you're moving more and more places and institutions are moving to being open to this BDS movement that I think does delegitimize Israel as a democratic Jewish state. I believe that the key way we legitimize Israel, what is at the core of Israel's legitimacy? For me, perhaps it's partly because it's a Jewish state. But for most people in the world, the core of Israel's legitimacy is its democratic character. And I believe that safeguarding Israel's democratic character is actually the best way of struggling against the delegitimizers, of Israel. Now, if people disagree with everything I've said, they think it's impractical, they just don't feel instinctively they don't like it, they think Jews should never boycott Jews. I would say, by the way, if you believe that Jews should never boycott Jews, I would simply ask you whether your shul would give Bernie Madoff an aliyah. Or whether your shul would give someone who has left his wife in Agunah, who has not given her a get, a Jewish divorce, an aliyah. I would like to believe the answer is no, that in fact you do, under certain circumstances, boycott Jews. But if you disagree with everything I've said, fine. I would simply turn the question over to you. If you believe that settlement growth and settlement subsidies are a threat to Israel's character as a democratic Jewish state, then what would you propose we do in trying to get a handle on it while there is still time to preserve Israel as a democratic Jewish state?
I take that. You realize what Peter just said? After 45 years, all the Jewish settlers are in less than 1% of the West Bank. And Peter's trying to convince us that you take that little 1% and you beat them up. After 45 years, it's still less than 1%. And he's trying to tell me that you have to collectively punish them. Because if you don't punish them, maybe that 1% might become 1.2% in 20 years. So I think it's completely outrageous to make the claim that although 99% of the West Bank is still available for the Palestinians, to make the claim that somehow these Jewish settlers in the less than 1% of the West Bank are this huge threat to a future two-state solution. It's utterly outrageous, and I won't even get into the disingenuous comparison between Bernie Madoff and these noble settlers that were sent there by Shimon Peres. A Nobel Prize winner is the one who sent the settlers to the Judea and Samaria.
I have, this gets to a question of who is in and who is out of the pro-Israel tent. On my blog, which is on the Jewish Journal, I announced this event tonight, and a comment came back, which thankfully was not put on the blog because it was slanderous. They said, because we're having Peter here to speak, Temple Israel of Hollywood should have a name change to Temple Anti-Israel of Hollywood. So, and you know, thankfully, I mean, there are certain rules about slander going on, anything relative to the the Jewish Journal website. This is a question for both of you. What do you feel should be minimum standards for any American Jewish group or Israel non-governmental organization, NGOs, to be included within the pro-Israel tent? And I want to throw out some names of organizations for you to reflect if any of these you feel should be in or out. J Street, Jewish Voice for Peace, Zionist Organization of America, Shalom Achshav, B'Tselem, New Israel Fund, American Israel Public Affairs Committee. So there's controversy in one way or another on all of them, and I would like to ask David, would you start? What are the minimum standards, and are any of those organizations you feel, based on those standards, in or out of the pro-Israel tent?
I'm a terrible guy for boycotts. I hate boycotts. I would never boycott my friend Peter Beinart. All I would ask him is make sure you include me in all your debates, because I want to be there to make sure I rebut you. I want to be there to make sure.
That's why you're here, David.
So that's why I'm here. So I'm not a good guy to ask for boycott. I don't believe in boycotts. I went into meetings with Jewish Voices for Peace, although I did have to crash the party because I wasn't invited. I spoke with J Street. I like Jeremy. Look, if you're anti-Israel and you're anti-Zionist and you want to destroy Israel and you have activities that are anti-Zionist, I don't think, there's not much to talk about. But these organizations are not anti-Israel. They're not.
Jewish Voices for Peace is you would say, is not anti-Israel?
Well, I have to check whether they're pro-BDS. If they're pro-BDS, then that's sort of a red line.
Does anyone know? I don't know.
Yeah, because if you're pro-DBS, then you're working to delegitimize, the Jewish state. I have a problem with that. But, there is a large group within the left liberal movement that are not pro-DBS, that are pro-Israel in their own way. And I would never boycott.
What about you, Peter?
I would draw a distinction between who we allow to come and speak in Jewish communal institutions and who we define as pro-Israel. I think that I would say that any group that does not want Israel to be a democratic Jewish state in my mind, is not pro-Israel, because I think that actually at the core of Israel's identity is a democratic Jewish state. So I think that Jewish Voice for Peace is therefore at least agnostic on about whether it's pro-Israel, because it's not clearly in support of Israel's existence as a democratic Jewish state, but because it has questions about the Jewish part, right? It may be open to a secular binational state. On the other hand, the Zionist Organization for America on the right, it seems to be, is not really in support of Israel as a democratic state, since as far as I can tell, they basically would support something like annexing the West Bank, and therefore permanently holding those people as non-citizens. It seems to me, so if you're going to want to be machmir on the JVP side because it's not in support of Israel as a Jewish state, you should be equally machmir on the ZOA side because they're not in support of Israel as a democratic state. But in some ways, for me, it's, in terms of who gets invited into the conversation, in terms of synagogues and Hillels, it's all actually beside the point to me. I would invite both JVP and ZOA and the Satmars, who last I checked were not thrilled about Zionism, and I would invite Palestinians, and most Palestinians are not that thrilled about Zionism, because I actually think that putting aside the question of who's pro-Israel, we need to have a really, really open conversation in which we explore very fundamental questions. And I think that's going to mean that will mean having people on the stage who do have very substantial questions about both Israel's Jewish and its democratic character, and I don't think they should be barred from the debate because of that.
I'm in complete agreement.
They were both in complete. I'm glad to hear that, actually. So this is for both of you as well. Peter has been attacked viciously in the media and in Israel for this book. Also, there's been a great deal of praise. President Clinton thinks this is a very important book, as did Edgar Bronfman and Lee Hamilton and others that I mentioned at the very beginning. Why do you think this is happening? And Peter, I asked you this privately before. What's it like to be on the receiving end of this? So first, I'd like to ask David if you would respond. Why do you think that it has been so intense? And do you have any insight to offer?
I think my theory is that he connected it to issues that are very, very close to us, like these real hot buttons. For example, the new generation of Jews in America that are completely disconnected from Israel and Judaism. These are issues that are really where the stakes are very high, and in the way that the American Jewish establishment should speak about Israel. So there were issues, and I think that's why it created such a sort of a heated debate, is because he pushed some hot buttons on things that were very, very important to us. Now, I think the connections were overstated, especially in the first article, when he sort of connected the mistakes that Israel was making with the disconnection with American liberal Jews. And I think Peter sort of reflected that in his book. There was a little bit of a tweak where he tweaked it to the sort of liberal elites, and I applaud him for that, because he realized that there was some false connections in the original article. But I think, look, Peter's a very good writer. He's very passionate, and he's a Zionist, and he loves Israel. And whenever you have someone like that sort of puts a very strong message that connects the pressure on Israel, people are going to get a little defensive. And I think that's what happened. My problem with Peter is that it just doesn't work. That's my problem. It won't help us get closer to peace. If I thought it would help us get closer to peace, I would go for it. I would support him 100%. I just think his ideas will not get us closer to peace, if that answers your question.
It's true, I do draw a distinction in the book between a large group of younger American Jews who I think are primarily disconnected from Israel because they're disconnected from everything Jewish, or anything Jewish, but I think a very significant group of very religiously committed emerging leaders in the American Jewish community, people graduating from Reform and Reconstructionist and conservative rabbinical schools, people in the independent Minyan movement, which is doing a lot to recreate vibrant Jewish communities in many American cities, who actually I think are very connected to Judaism, but deeply alienated because of the politics. And actually, it's not just me who sees that disconnection. Daniel Gordis, who disagrees with me politically as much as David and I do, actually has also written about this phenomenon of political alienation, so I think it's real. In terms of the criticism, look, I've tried to be very clear about it. People don't believe me when I say it, but I really have never said and do not believe that I am in any way brave. I was just reading that Irshad Manji, who is a woman, I think very brave woman, who criticizes the kind of theocratic, jihadist, Salafi tendency in much of that's happening in parts of the Muslim world, was speaking in Indonesia and was physically attacked with bats. And her assistant was very badly injured. I've never had anything even in the same universe as that. People sending you an email, including some of my family members, sending you an email saying, you're totally wrong. I think it's awful that you wrote this book. Why should a nice Jewish boy like you be saying these terrible things about Israel? Or even saying you're a self-hating Jew. I mean, come on. There are journalists around the world who actually suffer bodily injury and imprisonment and even die because of things they say. Thank goodness it does not happen. Thank goodness that Israel is not one of the countries where that happens very significantly. But I would say in the West Bank, it is more of a possibility. But I am not in one of those countries, Syria, Iran, God forbid. I'm in the American Jewish community. So yeah, Jews argue with each other. They get very upset. Sometimes they lose their cool. Sometimes I think they say things that maybe they might regret afterwards. But it's been fine. Truthfully, it's been fine. I knew that I was walking into a very emotional and very passionate argument. I did it with my eyes open. I did it for the same reason that people responded so negatively, because I truly, truly care. I truly care about the Jewish state that my children and David's children are going to inherit. And in some ways, I'll even say that when people respond with extreme hostility, I at least feel like we have something in common, which is that we care. And truthfully, sometimes what scares me more is the very large group of American Jews, especially younger American Jews, who can't be roused to any passionate feeling about this because they don't really care that much one way or another.
Well, despite my love and respect for Peter, one of the things that does disappoint me is I think somehow the debate has been dumbed down. I think the incredible attention and focus that's been put on the idea of putting more pressure on Israel has taken away from the complexity of the debate. This is a very complex situation, and Israelis are going through tremendous moral struggle. It's not as if Israel doesn't want what Peter wants. They want it as bad as he does, right? So I think some of the complexity and the nuances have been lost with this utter obsession with pressuring Israel, and that disappoints me. And I think, though, tonight, we've tried to reflect the complexities a little more than some of the other debates that I've seen. But I think one of the things that disappoints me is the dumbing down of a debate, where and that's what happens when you get so focused and single-minded. And Peter has been focused and single-minded on this idea of pressuring Israel more. You end up with a polarized debate, because not all debates are created equal. We have a tendency in the Jewish world to love all debates. And as long as we start a debate, then it's always good. But the truth is, some debates are deeper and more interesting than others. And I find one of the things that's come out of the crisis of Zionism, because it's so, in my view, so exaggerated, that I think it's taken away from the nuances of the situation, which are tremendously complex.
One last question for each of you. Is there something that you would have liked to have said to this group tonight that you didn't say? Peter?
That's very kind to give me that opportunity. I think on the small point, we know we've going back and forth about saying that it only matters that Israel, that the settlements occupy 1%. If that were really the significant number, rather than the fact that the municipal area is 10% and that the regional councils are 44%, and that Area C, which is the area that Israel controls in the West Bank, is 60%, then Israel would have been willing to essentially make a land swap of 1%. In fact, no Israeli leader has been anywhere near that. If you look at the security barrier, the separation barrier, whatever you want to call it, it essentially takes in about 10% of the West Bank. That's the actual reality we're talking about. That's not even putting aside the Jordan Valley, which is another 25% of the West Bank that Benjamin Netanyahu has said wants to have Israeli soldiers there essentially permanently. So I think that this 1% number really doesn't actually characterize the situation of Israel's control on the West Bank, nor Israel's demands, in fact, for control. On the question of whether there's a consensus in Israel, I don't think there is the kind of consensus that David would suggest. In fact, the Likud party's official platform is still opposed to a Palestinian state. Netanyahu has not changed it any more than Hamas has changed its own horrific charter. And in fact, we've had prominent people from his own government saying this government's position is anti-two-state. I think Israelis are actually deeply divided. If you ask the majority of Israelis whether they would allow a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem, they'll actually take David's position. The majority will clearly say they oppose a Palestinian state in East Jerusalem, even though, as Olmert and Barak understood, there will be no two-state solution in a Palestinian state without a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem. I guess the only other thing I would say, and it's not because of anything David said, but it is because it's something that I feel like never really gets mentioned about my book, is just to quote something in my book, because I think it gives a character of the way I try to write about Israel that is not only critical of Israeli policy, but in fact, I believe is critical of Israeli policy because I believe that Israel's accomplishment as a democratic state is so remarkable that I have such reverence for it, and it is precisely for that reason that I don't want to see it undermined. So I'm going to give a short quote here. This is what I write about Israel near the beginning of my book. In a nation that has lived since its creation with the ever-present threat of war, a strain that would have turned countries less nourished by liberal ideals into police states, these I'm talking about, and I list before that all of the rights that Israel gives to Arabs and all of the right of open debate inside the 1967 lines. It is far from, these are impressive accomplishments. It is far from clear that under similar circumstances, any of the democracies that criticize Israel's human rights record would have done better. Certainly, no American familiar with the way the U.S. government treated German Americans during World War I, Japanese Americans during World War II, or even Muslim Americans during the War on Terror, during wars that, unlike Israel's, mostly took place thousands of miles from Israel's shores, has any cause for sanctimony. So for me, this is a book, and this is a debate that I come out of not just love for Israel as an idea, but out of enormous reverence and admiration for what Israel has accomplished. And then the question for me is, how do we act on that love and that reverence? And it seems to me we act on that love and that reverence by fighting to protect what makes Israel great. And I believe that an Israel without democracy is not an Israel that incredible generation that wrote the Declaration of Independence envisioned, and ultimately it won't be an Israel that we will want to hand down to our children and grandchildren.
David?
All I want to say is that if you really believe in this reverence and this incredible accomplishment that Israel is, then don't use words like crisis, because words like crisis narrow the debate, and they create a certain panic that I think doesn't do justice to the greatness that Israel and everything it's accomplished in 64 years. So the last thing I want to share with you is to see if we can broaden the debate about Israel, broaden the way we express our love for Israel. That self-criticism is a Jewish value, but it's not the only Jewish value. There are other Jewish values, and it's not simply about Hasbara. It's the idea of somehow incorporating a big view of Israel, and the idea of a two-state solution is part of that view. And that's what I'm missing in the debate. I'm missing a holistic view of Israel, where, like Leon Wieseltier said, we can defend Israel and criticize it at the same time. Somehow we sort of do one or the other. But the Jewish way is not to do one or the other. The Jewish way is to marry both. And when you talk about the crisis of Zionism, you're not marrying both. Because in the word crisis, I don't see the word opportunity. And I see Israel as a hotbed and a reservoir of incredible opportunities. And that's my problem with the obsession with putting more pressure on Israel, no matter how great the goal is. I'd like to see the debate on Israel, like we do at the Jewish Journal, have a broad debate that's holistic and that includes all kinds of different point of views and that touches on this complex struggle that's going on in Israel right now. Peter's right. Peter's right when he says that a lot of Israelis right now are not sure about a two-state solution. A lot of them feel that they've been burned by the past. So it's true, and that's part of the complexity I'd like to see reflected in his next book, and that I will try to reflect in my next book. Because part of this is also about building pride in our children. And pride that's based on knowledge, rather than just saying atikva, knowledge. And there's a tremendous amount of knowledge about Israel that needs to be conveyed, besides the fact that it hasn't been able to accomplish peace with the Middle East. And this gets lost in the debates. We're so obsessed with getting what we want, which is a two-state solution, that we forget to talk about so many other complexities, so many other problems. And we got all those problems, this incredible corrective mechanism that I'm so proud of in Israel. I'm not just proud of Startup Nation. I'm proud of complex corrective nation. I'm proud of all those NGOs that fight for the rights of minorities. And all that gets lost when we sit and have these debates on whether we should pressure Israel more to have a two-state solution. And my final point, I'm not joking. I'd like to go with Peter to Ramallah, because I really do believe that we need to have a serious discussion about putting pressure on the Palestinians to return to the peace table. And I'm willing to go with him anytime he wants. Thank you very much.
To both of you, thank you. Peter has his book here for sale, and I'm sure if he's not too exhausted, he'd probably sign a book or two. Thank you both. This has been a wonderful opportunity for all of us.